is not only needs no introduction, but I will do it anyway in the sense that he's also the chairman of the advisory board of CITI, and we're very happy and glad that he's has lent his help, assistance, wisdom, and support to us. Bob is at Facebook now. He was at Cisco before. Before that, he was at the FCC, head of the policy planning group that was essentially, as I described it in the past, he was kind of the brains of several FCC chairmen in the past. And he's well known, well traveled around the world. So, Bob, without further ado, please go ahead with the pen.
Thanks, Ellie. I really appreciate it. If people, again, as Ellie said, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. I don't know, Jason, if you're going to be able to. You see, you'll be able to, as administrator, mute people if there's noise. So, as Ellie said, this first session in terms of the discussion, we have Tom Hazlett and Rob Frieden. And I'm not quite, since I see Rob's slide up on the presentation screen, I guess we're going to start with Rob. And as Ellie pointed out, there's this discussion about whether it's in, for example, the front page of today's Wall Street Journal about Google, or in the Financial Times earlier this week, or in fact yesterday, a Financial Times piece about how Walmart is actually coming back to be able to compete in the e-commerce space with Amazon after people assumed that nobody would ever compete with Amazon. The question is about this evolution of the digital economy. And
Mike screws with me. Just give me a second.
And it's really beyond just the media.
Can I please have a second to fix this? Because
if you could mute yourself.
Jason's the one that needs to mute.
Jason needs to mute himself, right? So the questions are about how the market is evolving, levels of competition, how we need to think about competition and even define markets going forward. Come back to some of those things. So, Rob, why don't I turn it over to you for a short presentation to start off the conversation, and then Tom will turn to you. So, Rob, are you on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
That's okay, great. Excellent. Well, thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be able to participate, and I've got rather extensive slides that could take the better part of an hour, which I won't take, but I'm glad to share them with you. If we could go to the second slide, the main points may be as far as we'll go. I want to underscore starting that I'm not calling for more regulation or the nationalization or Wikipediaization of social networks or any platform whatsoever. On the other hand, I think it's very important to look at both sides of what's called a double-sided market, both the downstream flow to subscribers and then the upstream flow to content providers, app creators, CDNs, content distribution networks, and the like. Speaking of like, I think there's a lot to like about platform operation. It's not something that just appeared. We've had intermediaries from day one in commerce. And in this space, we've had broadcasters, networks, and the like. Credit card vendors are another example of long-standing intermediaries. On the other hand, with digitization and broadband, we now have the opportunity for internet platform operators to accrue great scale, positive networking externalities, and some would say, even though there are competitive multi-homing opportunities, that some of these markets, social networks being one, can capture large market share in a winner-take-all sort of sweepstakes. Further in my analysis, I'm not so convinced that just market share is the the be-all for all measures of what is good or bad for consumers. In the United States, my view is that the three major agencies, regulatory agencies, the Justice Department, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission, are using flawed market assessments, poorly calibrated tools to look at the digital and internet ecosystem and these two-sided markets. There's great emphasis on the downstream impact, and if anything, one of the sort of sub-thoughts in the paper I'm working on is that maybe we've been too concentrated on the downstream flow, particularly insofar as the issue of network neutrality. From my view, the existing regulatory regime has the potential for both false positives and false negatives. False positives in that you have ex ante regulation, you anticipate that there's a problem, you anticipate that consumers and competition will suffer, therefore you create a regulatory regime. On the other hand, ex post, after the fact, remedies might occur, if at all, after the harm has occurred, and you might not have justice delayed is justice denied. The Justice Department uses a Chicago school economic model that basically says if consumers are accruing short-term benefits, and there are lots of benefits, then really there shouldn't be any intervention on the part of the government. The Federal Trade Commission has shared jurisdiction with the FCC. There's uncertainty as to the scope of its regulation.
Ellie's trying to intervene for a second.
Sure.
Rob,
Can you hear me?
Could somebody where there's a vacuum cleaner or something like that in the background, please mute your microphone?
Yeah,
Because
yeah. Everybody should just mute except when you want to speak. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that vacuum cleaner is heard across. Okay. All right. Okay, I think it is Rob's vacuum cleaner. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I think they're sucking up leaves outside my office right now. I think. At any rate, the Federal Trade Commission has shared jurisdiction with the FCC, and it's unclear as to what their scope of interest and skills are. They aren't involved in carriage issues and common carrier issues in particular. And then the FCC, as mentioned, has an emphasis on downstream impact insofar as network neutrality. But there's a lot of sort of issues that you wouldn't expect to drive FCC outcome, and in part, it's a political orientation and who's in the majority. So my view is that governments need to assess both sides of the two-sided market. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll go quickly through the concept of double-sided markets, and it's something that I think most of our participants are familiar with. You can substitute in the center cable television company, network, social network, pay system or whatnot, upstream content providers, app generators, creators, software creators, and then downstream consumers. There are three, if we can go to the next slide, three that we can look at in the internet ecosystem: ISPs. This slide just basically says it's something that's already working in the information, communications, and entertainment marketplace, the ICE marketplace, broadcast networks. The next slide talks to the ISP as an intermediary or platform. If we can go to that one quickly. The ISP serving the last mile is the Comcast, the Cox Communications, what have you. And then upstream, there's CDNs and content providers. We also have intermediaries who are generating operating systems for wireless. That's the next slide, quickly. And then the next slide after that are social networks and the like. That's three different ecosystems. So if we go to the next slide very, very quickly, there are a lot of good things to say about the intermediary double-sided configuration, particularly in the internet ecosystem. There's scale and efficiency gains, and in particular, the platform operators able to calibrate, well, who's going to pay for this? And in many, many instances, there are free rider opportunities whereby the consumer on the downstream flow gets a free credit card or gets to borrow money for 30 days at no interest, and you don't have to pay for the card, for example. So the broadband platform operator can calibrate who's going to pay, and in many instances there are opportunities for a lot of consumer welfare enhancement. The next slide identifies some of the downsides, particularly if you look at both sides of the market. We know that there are really very positive gains for consumers. Amazon, for years now, has offered a very attractive price points for a lot of services. They want to get shelf space, they want to get market share, and they're less concerned about profitability. And that really goes against the Chicago school mindset that says you would never sort of predatorily price or promotionally price for too long because there's no certainty as to when you would be able to recoup that. At any rate, if you look upstream, there are all sorts of consequences of platform operators, insofar as the quid pro quo of providing a very attractive service like participating in Facebook's social networking in exchange for allowing Facebook to collect data, to analyze that data, to market that data, and the like. Often consumers don't necessarily read their subscription agreements and understand what they're giving up in terms of value. Similarly, intermediaries like Amazon, if they really wanted to sharpen their pencils, could use what's called dynamic pricing or surge pricing to calibrate with great specificity and alacrity exactly how much to charge each individual customer, sort of sizing them up the way a used car dealer might in the physical world. Surge pricing is something that consumers love when it results in a low price, but if you're going to a New Year's Eve party or a Christmas party or whatnot, and there's a lot of demand, then they really sort of recoil from significantly higher prices. Consumers may not know or have a sense of really what the quid pro quo is. If we could go to the next slide, please. So part of the whole question as to the power of intermediaries is whether they've sort of locked in consumers, they've sort of taken control over the ecosystem, and you have things like the gig economy and impact on corner stores and bookstores and the like. So there are significant upstream consequences. I'm saying that the cost-benefit analysis is very important in terms of looking at both sides of the platform or intermediary function. AT&T gave us a little snapshot of the value of that upstream analysis when, for a very, very short period of time, some of their U-verse wireline broadband subscribers were presented with a proposition that if they paid $29 extra per month, that the company, AT&T Wireline U-verse, would use less data analytics, less data mining. That generated a lot of consumer pushback, but it didn't necessarily result in less data mining or discounts. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just very quickly, because I want to fit within the 10 minutes, the Justice Department has a view very much embracing the Chicago school reticence to get involved in mergers and acquisitions, and a lot of this has to do with a sort of vertical analysis, not unlike the AT&T Time Warner acquisition. The next slide talks about the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC. Suffice to say that my view is that some of their analysis is not necessarily working with great calibration in this internet ecosystem. If we could go past the next slide and the next slide quickly, FTC, FCC. Now to the conclusions, please. First of all, I think consumers and governments aren't fully apprised of the trade-offs, both upstream and downstream, particularly when intermediaries have accrued economies of scale and efficiency and networking effects and the like. It's increasingly clear, I think, that consumers have to contribute more in value or don't appreciate what they contribute in exchange for access to what this social network has to offer. there's a case, because I have a law background, I'm not an economist, and we have an economist on the panel, but there's a case involving the United States versus American Express, which I think is very instructional. It's a very complicated case, but suffice it to say, American Express has a no steering policy for vendors who offer or who will accept the card. A no steering policy means that you can't, as a vendor, say, well, don't use American Express, use Visa because it's cheaper for us. And the lower court said that anti-steering language in an affiliation between the credit card company and the vendor is bad, bad, bad. And the appellate court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, said, no, wait a minute, let's look at both sides. Maybe that anti-steering language enables American Express to be competitive in the marketplace, and maybe a fourth credit card company is good. And besides, if you look at both sides, holistically, there's a lot that maybe American Express can offer by way of free rider opportunities or consumer welfare enhancement opportunities that it wouldn't be able to do if it weren't in the business or if it didn't have that anti-steering language. So that's a case I call your attention to. It's a little heavy lifting in the analysis, but I think the bottom line point is that what appears to be something that's consumer benefiting may not be so if you look holistically. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up with just a view that government agencies need to assess market impacts, not necessarily just market share, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index of percentage market penetration. There's a lot of interactivity between both sides, and platform intermediary operation is going to have significant effects both downstream and upstream. And if there's one thing I can emphasize, it's that we're not paying attention to that upstream flow. So I think I'm within 10 minutes. I reserve the balance of my time, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, actually, you were right on.
Thank you. I rehearsed.
Yeah, good. So I've got a bunch of questions, but first I want to turn to Tom Hazlett, the economist on the panel, to get Tom's perspective. Tom, can you hear us?
Yes, I do. Do you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Are you, so you're just on the phone, or are you going to, oh, I can actually see you. We're on the video.
Hi, Anna.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm giving a shout out to Anna. Nice to see you.
And she's waving her hands. That's great.
And she's there. Great. Thank you for having me. And I'm delighted to participate. I hope I can bring something to the virtual table here, but I'm really keen to learn. I know this session has been planned for some time, but given that, the convergence of events here is eerie. You folks, just to pump demand for this discussion, apparently have been arranging hearings in Washington and controversies around the planet. So I'm duly respectful of your ability to orchestrate events. But there are wild times, of course, in tech sector politics, and the laissez-faire that has been the Silicon Valley mantra seems to be challenged in a way that's potentially fundamental. Some might call it the revenge of the regulators, because there is, this political flow from multiple sides of the fence. You certainly see conservatives now, in extraordinary terms, talking about invoking the fairness doctrine. Newt Gingrich striking out to say that the new platforms and social media are public utilities, need to be regulated as we did for electrical grids a century ago. And of course, there's a lot of sentiment on I suppose all sides of the spectrum now to push net neutrality from the core to the edge. It's funny when you see people accusing other political parties of hypocrisy on this, for being in favor of net neutrality for one set and against it for another, and then the hypocrisy is repeated by simply those allegations of hypocrisy, because it seems that it's very confusing to keep up with what people are for and against. Anyway, that's the Washington dance. That's the politics of it. The question is where we go in the marketplace, and of course regulators have a hand in that. That's the exciting part, the part that you're talking about and everybody is interested in. But from the market side, there is this very fundamental decision-making process. It's been going on obviously for decades, and it's coming to the fore, and that is how the firms view themselves either as common carriers or as curated platforms. And there are certainly a lot of arguments in favor of either. And what we're seeing is shifts in the business models and shifts in the demand on the part of the public, both as consumers and as voters, to perhaps have firms do things differently. Regulators hear these and then they respond. But there's no easy answer to this. Of course, the firms have very complex calculations as to exactly how to formulate their business models. And in essence, the firms, the social media platforms, search engines, and so forth, have a very large interest in neutrality. But they're also quite aware that in responding to customers, there is a demand for editing and curation and putting some walls up. Walled garden became a term of pejorative, but to some extent, of course, the people like gardens, people like walls that help parties tend to the garden. And so the question is not whether or not there's going to be some of that, but how high those walls are and where do you put them. So it's quite interesting now. You have companies like Federal Express, not considered perhaps an internet carrier, but they explicitly state that they are a common carrier. They are not a regulated common carrier. They are a voluntary private sector common carrier by their own design. They do not want to inspect the packages. They have been given liability by U.S. government actions, and the Federal Express response is, we are a common carrier. We do not inspect packages. If people are shipping things they should not be shipping, please go after the shippers. So they adopt this very explicitly. By the way, their close competitor, UPS, has a different business model, and they explicitly state that they are not a common carrier. They reserve the right to discriminate amongst shipments. Now, it is interesting, a recent development of Lyft and Uber actually banning certain customers on the basis of their tweets. And this may be on the sort of the far side of what people are talking about. It's not it's not Twitter, it's not Facebook, it's not Google, the information platforms. It's a service platform, if you will, for ride sharing. And yet there are some customers who, because of their views, and presumably because the companies, the software apps, as they call themselves, they're not service providers, they're just apps. They are protecting certain users of their apps, in this case, probably the drivers, from people who tweet things that are considered offensive to those core constituents or stakeholders. But it's quite an interesting move that these kinds of companies now are becoming much more active editors and stepping away from common carriage. Of course, Facebook is trying to create some walls, some spaces, some gardens that protect certain types of users of their software. And you can certainly see this to some extent, Google and elsewhere, Twitter, and down the list. They're trying this delicate balance, neither fish nor fowl, common carrier nor edited publication. They do want to invite a maximum coverage, but you have trade-offs on both sides. I don't have the answer for you right here. I hope that policy is not herky-jerk, that there are not ad hoc rules that get a political wind and immediately blow into the marketplace as mandates. Rob Frieden, who we've just heard, does talk about false positives and false negatives getting through the regulatory screens, allowing things that may be dangerous to customers versus having too much regulation and suppressing innovations that would be valuable to customers. I do have my own priors on this, certainly having studied radio spectrum and being the author of a recent book, The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone, Yale University Press 2017. Please click on Amazon. The story in radio spectrum allocation is certainly that the type 2 errors, the suppression of valuable resources that could come into the market to spur innovation, that has been the overwhelmingly large problem. Allowing too much market competition has really not been the factor that is registered as a social problem. So yeah, we have our views as to how other markets and other evolutions have played out in communications or the economy in general. And of course, that's why we call certain views the Chicago view or the anti-Chicago view. These are informed opinions that result in certain models of the world that tend to look in different directions. But that's the debate we're in now. I hope that there is an evolution in the marketplace that allows these firms to adopt rules that do respond to their customers and do have maximum scope given the underlying legal regime of the United States and other countries to serve customers. So no PowerPoint slides. I'm in a 12-step program to give up on PowerPoint, so I'm only on step 3. So it's a work in progress. But I hope I don't break out in cold sweats. And anyway, I thank you for giving me a slot on the panel.
Thanks, Tom. That was actually very useful. Speaking of the PowerPoint addiction, we still are looking at Rob's PowerPoint slide. So Jason, I don't know whether we want to just leave that up or we can sort of stop sharing PowerPoint at this point so we can see more people, more of the participants on the screen. That would be, I think, a useful thing. So I have some questions, but I'd like to open it up. And I'm not quite sure with people raising their hands how I see that, or whether Jason, you're going to see that and open it up. But I would like to. This has been a very U.S.-centric conversation, and as Ellie said, it's actually a global conversation, global debate. And I know that we have people from around the world and people with international perspectives. So if somebody who's in the room, as we would say, that has a perspective, a global perspective, or a perspective from another country, that would be great. You can raise your hand or just unmute and speak, and we'll figure out how to find you. Nobody? Okay. I'd like also to go back though to did somebody? No. Jason, are you able to see people raise their hands?
Can we raise our voices?
Yes, raise your voice. Hi, Loretta.
Okay. Hi, Bob. This is a couple of us from the European Commission, and it was hard to get in from some computers, but we succeeded, so we're all in one room.
That's great.
Sometimes you can't trust the machines. They're each individualistic. There's no equality of access. Anyway, I wanted to agree with Tom Hazlett on the fact that we're seeing a revenge of the regulators, and that the laissez-faire capitalism of Silicon Valley is gone. And there are two issues, of course, is that taxation is one that is prevalent, but also the opening up to innovation from startups, which was also mentioned by Ellie as the one factor that changes oligopolistic markets. And so I wanted to ask the panel to comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Loretta. Good to hear you. Rob, Tom, do you want to talk about that? And I might just say one thing about the taxation issue. From the perspective of somebody watching from this side of the Atlantic, you know, the taxation questions, which have become now sort of global, the OECD is looking for ways to address or have recommendations to address some of the what appears to be tax arbitrage. But from this side of the Atlantic, it appears that the taxation arbitrage opportunities were created by countries, not companies, and that companies have been following the law, and that they have merely been taking advantage of the differences in the different tax structures in different countries, particularly within and among European countries. And that the taxation issue, which is an important one for countries, is being used as a way to actually address what otherwise would be competition questions. So, you know, and so maybe Loretta, you and your colleagues from the commission might want to respond to that. But let me hear first from Tom and Rob. Tom?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Loretta. I probably should say I'm not rejoicing in the revenge of the regulators or bemoaning the fact that there has been largely a laissez-faire policy. It's I think people should be clear about where we are. So these changes are taking place, certainly, but the laissez-faire umbrella over Silicon Valley has produced a lot, and people should be aware of that. Certainly, the arbitrage issue is a difficult one for governments. When governments are charging differential rates, you know, through the tax system, mobility is their enemy, and mobility, I mean, through the internet, that's the ultimate reduction of friction, and you're going to have new challenges for how you finance government. The public finance questions obviously put governments in the same quandary, not in identical dimensions or terms, but very similar or parallel to what the companies are facing with the changing business models. So in terms of the international global policies and companies facing different environments, yeah, non-harmonization is a big problem. Certainly these international firms doing business in 200 markets have their hands full. People flying around the world like Bob Pepper, trying to find out what the you know, what the local policies are is a very big part of their business and a very important line item in the budget. Ideally, harmonization is where we like to be, but we still want competition between jurisdictions because we want there to be you know, those forces you know, to constrain monopoly, whether it be on the private or the state side, but also for experimentation and, you know, having markets that are more open here and allow these kinds of experiments that wouldn't happen elsewise. So yeah, there's certainly some competition, some of it healthy, between the jurisdictions, and the states have to participate there. But I think that getting policies that are benign and do emphasize the evolution of the market, meaning that they're not going to be heavy with ex-ante rules, particularly early in the blossoming of any particular industry or sector, are the rules that are most successful. We've seen that, and we have to remember that.
Thanks, Tom. Rob, did you want to comment?
Yes, I'll take a stab at the issue of impact on startups and the response of incumbents. And really, it's not just a matter of affecting incumbents. It's a matter, particularly on the upstream flow, of affecting secondary or tertiary related markets. So in one case, you have Snap, a company that was subject to an article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal about how they've had to make adjustments to basically get with the Facebook advertising model. But also, if you look at the secondary impact, even on incumbents, social networks and Google are substantial players in the news dissemination business, even though they don't necessarily qualify as journalists or employed journalists. So there are all kinds of antitrust implications. And you have to ask, when is it a matter of make versus buy? Just a simple benign issue of whether a social network or a platform operator of any sort wants to buy out a potential competitor or acquire their technology versus sort of expanding their wingspan into adjacent markets. I'm not saying that you should extend your regulatory gauntlet, but understand that particularly when it comes to millennials and students and the like, they're getting their news from Google and Facebook because the platform facilitates access. And I guess the last point is that a lot of news creators have said that if we're not on Facebook's platform, if we're not searchable through Google, we don't exist. One remedy might be something that was proposed by some of the incumbent journalistic organizations who said, why don't the legislature waive a prohibition on sort of collusion or cooperative negotiation with social networks and allow the Associated Press and other major news vendors or journalistic organizations to negotiate a compensation arrangement collectively instead of individually with social networks. I'd like to ask Bob whether you thought that would be.
Yes, so Rob, thanks. I actually raises some interesting questions because, as Tom said, this is about changing business models, not only for companies, but also the way governments approach things. And your last point, I actually was going to point out that it is, I don't believe, a coincidence that there's been a drumbeat in not just the Wall Street Journal, but all of the print press owned by News Corp because of the challenges that they're facing going particularly after Google and the search model. And you talked about, everybody gets their news from Google and Facebook. Actually, they get the news from the news sources, not Google and Facebook, but rather it's the search, or that's how they find the news. And we'll just have to see whether waiving antitrust exemption for collective bargaining actually is going to be successful, because if you recall, and I know Austin Schlick is on, he might want to jump in and comment, but when Spain, imposed restrictions on Google in terms of news search, and Google said, okay, fine, we're not going to, if that's the way it is, we're not going to pay. Again, Austin, correct me if I'm wrong. And therefore, we're just not going to have any links to Spanish press. The Spanish press realized that that was a huge penalty for them, because people found them through search on Google, and they got the law reversed or changed. So I think this is an issue of be careful what you ask for, because it's fundamentally, as you point out, about changing business models for everybody. And the only thing it reminds me, not the only thing, but one of the things it reminds me of from my FCC days, Tom says he's a recovering PowerPoint user. I think of myself as a recovering regulator. But the incumbents, the existing players, would always come in and say to me, if you allow these things to happen and you allow these new entrants, it's going to be the end of the world, the end of everything we know. You have to protect me, right? And the new entrants would come in and say, if you don't open up the market, we're never going to be able to get started, and it's the end of the world doesn't even begin for us. And the question is, to what extent are we seeing these very fundamental shifts in market structure business models and relationships with consumers being fought out in the context of regulation. The other thing I just want to point out, going to Loretta's second question about being open to innovation. I think of this in terms of conversations, frankly, that I had with people at the Commission, European Commission, and some of the U.S. Players about 2 years ago. When complaints were being raised in Brussels about the growth and the quote dominance of U.S. cloud providers, and I think this is going to be addressed on the last session today. And I said, so the cloud providers, how did that happen? Right? You had firms that have data centers distributed globally, and the data centers were built for their own internal use, but they recognized that there was excess capacity. Second, those data centers were connected with very, very high quality, high speed broadband networks, and they could provide distribution. And what they did was they decided that they were going to make some of their compute power in those data centers in terms of public cloud, right? This whole evolution to public cloud starting with AWS, right? There was nothing to do with regulation, nothing to do, they just were able, they were creative. They had capacity. They thought in new ways, they thought of new business models. And at the time of this conversation, there was great, and again, Loretta and our friends in Brussels jump in, but there was great angst about there was somehow something unfair by these US companies, AWS, Microsoft with Azure, Google Cloud, and others, IBM, making shared cloud, public cloud services available, which fundamentally changed compute power and the ability for startups to be able to actually, not require as much investment to do a startup because you didn't have to buy servers and run all of that yourself. And there's great angst. So my question to my colleagues in Brussels was, what prevented, so going through what those requirements were, what prevented a world-class, great European company based in Germany, SAP, from doing that? Was there any regulation? Were there any barriers? The answer, of course, is no. They just didn't think about it. So the question for our Brussels friends, as well as others on the panel, is to what extent is some of this actually about existing players wanting to catch up? To what extent, is this about wanting to use regulation to substitute for new business models, or to provide time for people to shift legacy business models when there have been innovators that have actually developed things and they've moved forward quickly? So
Bob,
just throw that out there. Anybody want to jump in?
Yep, Bob, can you hear me? It's Matthias.
Yes, Matthias, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you see me? I might be also part of this Brussels bubbles, and I just want to point out that besides the tax issue and the cloud issue, which you mentioned, there is a big thing about data mining and big data, which becomes a lot of relevance in the European discussion. And the issue is there really a level playing field between the OTT platforms and the classical providers in the aspect of data mining? And when it comes to regulation, there is really a different set of regulatory hurdles for classical players like telco players on GDPR, on e-privacy, and it's fairly impossible. I just had a case about that. For classical providers, TV providers, to use viewing habits of their customers and to make a recommendation. Or maybe if you have seen Downton Abbey and you want to see Outlander, it's illegal, fairly illegal to do that if you would send out a recommendation to your own customer because of very high standards and very high levels of privacy, of security, and other kind of things. On the other side, if you look to Amazon and the OTT players, Facebook and others, they constantly do that, even with European customers. If you buy a book in Amazon about horses, you immediately get the next day recommendations for other horses. And just one example, So my view would be, is this discussion on the regulatory side about a level playing field cross-Atlantic, especially on the big data issue, a relevant issue? Because I think the discussion here in Europe or in Brussels is that the usage of the customer data becomes more and more like a kind of gold mine, and that people are paying with their personal data. So they don't get the services for free. They are paying with their data, and with Alexa and all this voice generation, which is now in the market, it will even more grow. So what do you think? Is that a relevant topic for the discussion?
Yeah, I believe it is, and by the way, I would agree with you. Now, putting my Facebook hat on, we think the GDPR in Europe works. Is it perfect? No, but we think it's actually a good approach. So we work with and within the GDPR. The problem for the traditional players is that there are additional requirements, especially on the telco side, with the e-privacy rules. And the question is, if GDPR is good for every other industry and sector within Europe, why is it not good enough for broadcasters, cable companies, telephone companies, et cetera? It should be. And we've publicly taken that position because, what we see is that what's preventing the quote level playing field, which is, I think, a horrible term for other reasons, which we can talk about. The reality is that many European industries in the media space and the telecom space are still regulated as though it's the 1980s and 1990s, and that they are not, and you're not, permitted to take advantage of some of the newer technologies while still protecting consumer privacy, right? That's what the GDPR is about. So I would agree with you, but again, the difference is, if you want to call it arbitrage, but you pointed out Europe versus North America. I don't think it's Europe versus North America. I think it's new entrants in Europe, the platforms or the internet companies, the digital companies, retail that are subject to GDPR, and the traditional players that are subject to something more additional beyond GDPR. So it's not.
Bob, let me try to interject here. It's really interesting to see the dichotomy of viewpoints. I mean, I'm hearing from you that there's a kind of first mover advantage and superior business skills, build a better mousetrap, and the world will beat a path to your doorway. But on the other hand, it's a little cavalier to say that Facebook or Google is just one click away from obscurity. The power, I think what I heard was that the power of data mining actually helps bolster the incumbency or the market dominance of some of the successful companies, the so-called unicorns. So I'd be curious to hear from you as to how you sort of flesh out the view that you're one click away from obscurity because of multi-homing opportunities versus the ability as a first mover to sort of bolster through acquisitions and through data mining.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a one click from obscurity. That's a nice phrase. It's a clickbait thing, kind of like, oh my God, one click. But the reality is, if you look at, for example, search, and again, if Austin's still on, I'd urge him to jump in. But when you think about search, the reality is, when people are searching for products, they don't, the majority of the search for products is on Amazon, not Google. And so, I look at things like, when you talk about multi-homing, WIC recently did a study on multi-homing, and how consumers like multi-homing. A very concrete example of that is, and by the way, with the moving into the app world on a mobile platform, it's nothing more than a tap away. When it comes to messaging and chat, WIC did this study that looked at 139 different applications. They call them rich interaction applications, RIAs. And if people don't know WIC, it's a German consultancy. They looked at 139 of these different applications. The average application had 9 functions. WeChat had something like 35 to 40 functions, adding one every 2 weeks. These are not just SMS, right? And they're not the same. So, and the drive and the need to innovate in that space and provide very different consumer uses and applications and experiences actually is what's driving the adoption. So it's very easy. I mean, and they don't, I mean, the multi-homing people like it. So I have on my phone, I have my SMS for my operator. I have Messenger. I have iMessage from Apple. I have WeChat. I have, internal chat within the work and Viber. So people can reach me using any one of those, and they just pop up with a little icon. So so it's not necessarily, it's a false choice to say one click away from obscurity. Rather, it's about entry, and what we're seeing is absolutely there is entry, and consumers prefer choices, and they use different spaces for different parts of their lives, work, family, friends, and they use different applications and different platforms for different things that they do. And again, I would urge you to take a look at the most recent WIC study. There were actually 2 different ones.
Yeah, Bob, this is Tom.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. There's a lot of dynamism in this marketplace, and you're certainly citing good examples. But I just want to point out that this idea that one click away from oblivion is some kind of a test for how much competition is actually in the market is a perfect example of the perfect competition prejudice. I mean, this textbook model that has very little application to what we do see or want to see in the internet space. We want firms to develop huge platforms with vast activities and investments. We want a lot to go into those platforms. We want marginal costs to be zero. And that's not perfect competition. We want firms to be constrained not by the fact that they're one click away from oblivion, but that they're 10 years of $500 billion in market equity. And that's what motivates these firms to do the next big thing. That's what the moonshots are about. That's what all of it is about. And so it is a Schumpeterian marketplace. It's not going to be perfect competition. It shouldn't be something you have to apologize or anybody else that you have invested and created through the competitive process, through in fact market selection, consumer satisfaction, a platform that will not disappear with the next click. And that's the competition we want. We want firms to go in that direction. Let me also say that, the protectionist angle is certainly something that's not specific to Europe. And in fact, we should be proud as Americans to see how much Microsoft has invested in promoting anti-Google policy in Europe and around the rest of the world. We certainly see that these kinds of political activities are strikebacks, to a great extent for investments that could have been made by firms, weren't made, and now the political process is being used. We do want to be aware of those processes, and in fact, regulators need to be very much aware that they're promoting competition rather than competitors. And just lastly, I love the Bob's example, thinking about the creation of the cloud and some firms coming up with an innovation business model. Just in listening to it and the excess capacity story for cloud storage, it immediately recalled that this is an old business model. This is 1960s computer time sharing. This is an idea that not only can anybody who read a history book or was around in the 60s to know that this is how the computer industry made its big mark in the marketplace, is by big mainframe computers that were hooked up to have people share time. And now we're doing it with massively more intense computing power and orders of magnitude more storage. But these business models need to remain flexible so that we can cycle in and out. That's another great story behind the importance of flexibility in the marketplace.
Thanks, Tom. So we're coming up on the time, is there anybody else that would like to jump in?
Pepper, this is Ellie. We had several people who on the chat function made interesting and good comments. So perhaps you want to recognize them so that they can speak to all of us.
Yeah,
Harry
I was just
Shapiro,
looking
for example.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellie. I was actually just looking at that. And so there were a number of people that had jumped in, and particularly Harry. I'm sorry, Ellie, go ahead.
Martin and Harry, for example.
Yeah, Marty.
Brian.
I was going to say Harry and Marty. So did you want to jump in? I mean, people should look at the chat window as well.
If I can, I don't know if you can even hear me.
You can see it, Harry. Go ahead.
Just wanted to say all this about how regulation might limit access to particular vendors or apps or all of that stuff, at least in the US, I think belies the fact that if we simply on the provisioning, last mile level end up with one or two providers who put in data caps and there's no net neutrality, so there's favored nation access for a few large players, then it doesn't matter about all that other stuff, because then there really isn't competition unless you're able, like shelf space in a store, to buy your way in.
Yeah. So thanks, Harry. So Harry's point, I think, is the sort of core net neutrality question on the actual access layer down the stack in layers 1, 2, and 3, if you will. And without that, and we were assuming we were not addressing that here. And I think the discussion was actually moving up the stack, but the lower layers do become essential. If you can't connect, you can't connect. But yeah, appreciate that.
Can I offer this? This is Len Cowley from AT&T.
Yes, please, Len.
I just want to say, fortunately, we're not going to end up with 1 or 2 ISPs in the U.S. Today, we pretty much nationwide have at least 2 wireline providers. And we all know the wireless networks are growing ever more capable. So prices are plummeting. Unlimited plans are now sort of the primary plans that are out in the marketplace. And we're moving to 5G, which is going to compete with the wireline networks without doubt. And it's going to be they're going to be video networks as well. So I think, and kudos to Ellie for structuring this conference to recognize that if there were concerns about that bottleneck in the last mile in the past, that's really moved up.
Oops, I think Len froze. Hold on, we'll come back to Len.
Well, he gave me kudos, so that's a good.
Yeah,
good
that does. But
the next
by the way, Len's absolutely correct, and that's why the next session is actually about the middle mile, because it turns out, especially, I mean, a lot of the work that we've seen, a lot of the work being done, especially in emerging markets in the rest of the world, the bottleneck is backhaul. It's middle mile, allowing operators, competitive operators, to scale from 2G to 3G to 4G, right? And so more investment is needed to do that, and there's a whole story there. So we're going to be coming up to that. Marty, did you want to say something? Because you had
Yeah, thanks, Bob. A couple of things. One is I'm kind of informed by the process of competition that took place in the wireless industry in Great Britain, over the last 15 years or so, where the competition started out, in terms of, well, I don't remember the exact sequence, but it went from coverage area to handset pricing over time, and then it moved to features and functions and interconnection, and all these things didn't happen simultaneously. They happened kind of over time as the various operators rolled out their networks and expanded into the marketplace. So my comment is really driven by the idea that not all competition, as in the Chicago model, for example, are about price. And I think what we need to do as competition authorities or potential competition authorities and consultants is to understand the particular conduct in each of the segments. I think we need to be very careful about market definitions as we move up and down this stack of providers. And I don't think, frankly, that we, as a profession, have quite come to grips with that yet. Maybe I'm just out of the loop too much, but that seems to be my conclusion.
No, I think that I think that's I think that's right, because but I'd love to hear from maybe just as a wrap up for the session, both Tom and Rob, to just final comments, but particularly on your point, which I think is correct, right? So why don't we move to, by the way, in chat, I would urge people to look at chat. There was a comment from Jolie around, community networks and satellite and OneWeb. Rich Clark, asking about why the valuation for application providers, I don't like the term OTT, are more than the underlying network. So there's some really good stuff there, as well as the link to the WIC study that I mentioned. And thanks, Jolie, for putting that up. But if we could go back, maybe wrap up with Tom and Rob.
Yeah, well,
Rob first, or Tom?
No, Rob first.
Rob first. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the opportunity. This is really very interesting how it's sort of played out. Specifically to that last point about the Chicago School and market definition, I'm working on that in a paper, and I think again going to one of my premises that the existing metrics isn't necessarily the best. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index of market share. I think you need to have a more holistic assessment of when is it a first mover who's built a better mousetrap versus used their dominance to sort of expand into secondary and tertiary markets. And market definition is a problem, but it's not necessarily just a function of quantitative calculation of market share. Very interesting to sort of hear the comments between a U.S. representative and a European representative, because I'm at this point not sure as to where the line is drawn between someone who's been a first mover and has been very successful and is moving mightily to maintain the status quo versus the sort of libertarian notion that you have a very robust and dynamic marketplace where new business models are just around the corner, and multi-billion-dollar unicorn valuations are also likewise to accrue to newcomers. So it's a very robust, interesting area, and lots of dichotomous viewpoints that we've assessed in a short time.
Thanks, Rob. Tom?
Yeah, well, great discussion, and it's going to be a good conference here. Just recently, I was talking to some people who are trying to understand a current U.S. merger, and they said, well, isn't there a theory about the vertical foreclosure problem? I said, oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a theory. The question is, does it apply? What are your empirical realities on this? Because there's stories every which way, and we really have to focus on theory and the empirical reality before we apply rules that are going to do more harm than good. So doing the empirics, let me just do a shout out for being also conscious of what some people, Deidre McCloskey actually has a book on this about the tyranny of the p-value. We have to be measured, literally. We have to be conscious of what the important statistically significant findings are, and then we have to balance the different types of errors that are made, classically the type 1 and type 2 errors that Rob talked about. And I suggest that if people want another take from another industry on this, there's this interesting paper by an MIT economist, Andrew Lowe, on Food and Drug Administration regulation in the U.S. And you can see the power of bad analysis, bad statistical analysis in drug approvals in the United States, where we don't take into account the potential value of a new drug, and we set the same statistical error standard across markets. Now, this is just it may seem off in the weeds in a market we don't care about. Actually, it's a great marketplace. Obviously, the high-tech contributions in medicine are wonderful. But what I'm suggesting here is that in our regulatory institutions, in information technology, we have to be very cognizant of exactly the same sorts of biases and really missteps in how we apply standard empirical analysis. And it's something that really bears thinking about. So thanks very much.
No, thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Rob. It's been a really good discussion. But the little hand and the big hand are converging. So our time is up. And we have another great panel looking at some of the at CDNs, middle mile, backhaul, as an issue. So Ellie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yes.
And thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Pepper, for moderating this, and Tom and Rob for speaking, and all of you others to participate. We're now going into